When the highway lights flickered in Culiacan on that late September night of 2024, something older than fear crept into the air, a tension that had been brewing under the skin of the cartel for years, undetected until it couldn't be ignored. For decades, they called it the Sinaloa Cartel, legendary, almost mythic, a network bound by loyalty, code, and invisible lines of power traced in smuggled dollars, hidden routes, and political whispers. But on September 9, 2024, those lines cracked. The arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada in El Paso, Texas, once thought loyal partner, once untouchable, became the spark. Rumors flew that he was betrayed by one of his own. Because in Sinaloa, betrayal is always personal, and legend has it that the godson of El Mayo, Joaquin Guzmán Lopez, a son of El Chapo, was complicit in his capture, handed over to authorities across the border. The message spread: trust can be a dagger. From that moment, peace, the kind that happens when people learn to stay quiet, is shattered. The factions known as La Maíza, loyal to Mayito Flaco, son of El Mayo, and Los Chapitos, led by the sons of El Chapo, began to move like two wounded predators in the same jungle, each circling the other. Culiacan, once a city that slept under the hum of checkpoints, fishermen, and nights that closed gently, now gasps at dawn. Gunfire sharp enough to wake the birds echoes through streets that only a year ago carried laughter. Markets close early. Mothers count the hours. Children hide when helicopters pass overhead. Bodies start appearing in places where no one expects them. Found in vans. Hung from bridges. Left in alleyways that hours before were filled with music and families. Messaging boards, banners, narco signs start to demand attention, names, threats, warnings. Public funerals become public warnings. Every murder leaves a message, sometimes a banner draped across a boulevard, sometimes a sombrero placed on a corpse, sometimes a pizza box, yes, a pizza box, small symbols flooding the public stage to tell which side is claiming the territory, or which betrayal is being answered. With more than 1,800 murders and thousands missing by mid-2025, the toll is staggering. Towns once quiet now tremble daily. The war has leaked beyond cartel codes into the streets of ordinary people. Schools close. Shops shutter. Roads become battle zones. And the media, where it still dares, reports that codes once obeyed inside the cartel, unspoken rules about how far to spill blood, how visible to be, where civilians had to be spared, they're gone. The rules of war have been erased. What remains is raw territory, raw pain, raw vengeance. But make no mistake, war like this never starts cleanly. It starts with one ledger entry. One phone call. One insult nobody thought mattered, until it blew up. And this? This is the moment when Sinaloa's shadow government split in two, when the cartel's empire began to fracture, and when every choice, every betrayal, would echo far beyond the hills and highways. You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story. You cannot understand the war without first seeing the land. Sinaloa is a tapestry of mountains, rivers, jungles, coastline, and hidden valleys, a geography that offers both secrecy and strategic corridors, a place where the earth itself conspires with smugglers. It is in those folds of mountain and forest that poppy fields first stretched, hidden from sight, and drug labs were carved into hillsides. Smugglers discovered that the more rugged the terrain, the fewer eyes watching, and that the Pacific coast and the Gulf routes gave paths to ports, to ships, to the world. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, as Colombia's cartels ruled the cocaine trade, Mexico's rural states were quiet, until smugglers realized they could shift from being escorts to suppliers. Sinaloa, already a region where marijuana and opium poppies were cultivated, became fertile ground for new ambition. From that land, a new empire was born, not overnight, not with a declaration, but piece by piece, lieutenant by lieutenant. the Guadalajara cartel fractured. Its elders were arrested, disappeared, or killed. Into that vacuum stepped men from the hinterlands: Hector Palma, Rafael Caro Quintero, El Chapo, El Mayo. The federation that became the Sinaloa Cartel was formed from old alliances and new ambition. Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán Lora, born in the mountains of Badiraguado, rose from small-time smuggling to transnational power by daring things others would not try: tunnels under the U.S. border, corruption inside justice systems, and a whisper network that spanned villages to capitals. Meanwhile, Ismael El Mayo Zambada kept his head low and his network wide. He built alliances, nurtured contacts in law enforcement, bribed officials. While Chapo was the daring phoenix, Mayo was the serpent weaving quietly through the undergrowth. Together they built a decentralized federation, not a rigid dictatorship but a loose network of cells, lieutenants, provincial bosses. Each ran their own route: local enforcement, extortion, labs. But all answered, in some measure, to shared principles: secrecy, non-violence in public when possible, bribery, respect for elders, cut for loyalty. In those years of peace under the cartel, Sinaloa operated like a shadow government. In towns, businesses paid a tax, quiet, predictable. Roads, ports, smuggling routes, fishery industries, even municipal licenses, these were regulated. The cartel kept order, resolved disputes, and in many places, the people saw fewer kidnappings or petty crimes than under weak municipal rule. The cartel's operations spread beyond drugs, extortion, human smuggling, mineral theft, illegal fishing, control of transport. It expanded into the Golden Triangle, Sinaloa, Durango, Chihuahua, and beyond, reaching dozens of Mexican states and many foreign markets. For years, that system worked, not without fear, but with enough predictability that people adapted. But beneath the calm, silent cracks were forming. Rival lieutenants felt ill-compensated, routes were contested, promises were broken, loyalties shifted. A seed of division sprouted where none was expected. And soon, just one deal, one disputed payment, one betrayal of trust would ignite that fault line into an inferno. By the mid-1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel wasn't just a name, it was a government within a government. Politicians sought its approval, police owed it allegiance. From local mayors to federal agents, everyone knew who truly held power in the hills. If the state wrote laws, Sinaloa enforced them in the shadows. But power, once tasted, never sits quietly. Beneath the cartel's alliance, greed and pride simmered. Some commanders believed El Chapo took too much credit, others whispered that El Mayo moved shipments behind the Federation's back. In an empire built on silence, even whispers can sound like gunfire. When El Chapo was first arrested in 1993, many thought the empire would collapse. Yet instead of shattering, it adapted. Mayo expanded his influence quietly, and others like El Azul kept the machinery running. Chapo's imprisonment became legend, a pause, not an end. And when he escaped in 2001 through that now famous tunnel, the myth of Sinaloa only grew stronger. The cartel learned something that day: they could survive anything: raids, betrayals, arrests, even death. The government could remove faces, but not the foundation. The foundation was built on family, secrecy, and a shared enemy: poverty. But loyalty is fragile when fortunes rise fast. As billions flowed, boundaries blurred. Business turned into bloodlines, bloodlines into business. The sons of the founders, the Chapitos, the Zambadas, grew up in a world where power was inheritance, not earned. Some wanted peace, others wanted glory. El Mayo preferred diplomacy, invisible power, the kind that moved through phone calls and coded messages. El Chapo's sons, Ovidio, Joaquin, Ivan, Jesus Alfredo, preferred spectacle. Their music blared through narco corridos, their luxury cars paraded through Culiacan. The new generation didn't fear visibility, they fed on it. To outsiders, Sinaloa looked untouchable. But inside, the seeds of a civil war were germinating. Some lieutenants felt slighted by the sons' arrogance. Others believed Mayo's old-school approach was obsolete. Even law enforcement insiders began to take sides: leaking intelligence for protection or profit. Then came the betrayal that no one saw coming, the moment the cartel's invisible balance tipped. A shipment lost. A payment delayed. A rumor that someone was cooperating with U.S. authorities. These things happen in the drug trade all the time. But this time, it wasn't about the money, it was about respect. From that moment forward, the code began to break. One faction blamed another. Trucks went missing. Informants vanished. Commanders stopped answering calls. Gunmen loyal to one side began to appear outside safe houses of the other. And all the while, both camps claimed they were protecting Sinaloa. The cartel, once united under an unspoken promise of order, now stood on the edge of something none of them had seen before, an internal firestorm that would consume its own creators. And all it took was one deal, one betrayal, to set the empire on fire. It began, as wars often do, with silence. Not explosions. Not gunfire. But the kind of silence that creeps into a city just before everything falls apart, when neighbors stop talking, when convoys move at night, and when the people of Culiacan can feel the ground vibrating long before the first bullet is fired. For years, the cartel's enemies came from outside. But in 2024, the threat came from within. On one side stood Los Chapitos, the heirs to El Chapo's legacy, impulsive, fearless, obsessed with control. On the other stood La Mayoza, loyal to El Mayo Zambada, older, strategic, rooted in discipline and business. They shared the same blood of Sinaloa, and yet, they began to kill their own. The spark came on a humid night in August, when a convoy of Chapitos gunmen entered a territory long considered Mayo's. A warehouse in Guasave, one that stored more than drugs, but weapons, vehicles, and encrypted radios, was raided. The attack lasted 8 minutes. By dawn, 10 men were dead, and the first line had been drawn. The next day, messages appeared on bridges, banners signed by La Mayoza. They accused Los Chapitos of treason, of breaking the pact that had kept peace for decades. The banners were public. Bold. They weren't just warnings, they were declarations of war. Within days, the city transformed into a chessboard of blood. Gunfights erupted in markets, near schools, even outside the governor's building. No one was spared. Civilians were trapped in their cars, ducking as armored convoys tore through intersections. The once invisible war had become visible. By early October, both factions had fortified their strongholds. The Chapitos dominated the north, Culiacan, Los Mochis, and the city's industrial zones. La Mayoza controlled the rural heart, Bataraguado, Guasave, and the mountains. The state police stayed out. The military watched. But neither dared to intervene, not yet. The battles weren't just fought with bullets. They were fought with money, with bribes, and with media control. Social networks became weapons, fake videos, doctored images, rumors of captures or deaths, all designed to shake morale and claim legitimacy. For the first time, the war for perception was just as fierce as the war for territory. Then came the night of the sirens. October 19, 2024. Culiacan plunged into chaos as simultaneous attacks broke out in 6 neighborhoods. Gunmen used drones to drop grenades. Explosions ripped through parked trucks. The city was cut off from electricity, and in the dark, people could hear the low hum of armored engines closing in. By morning, the death toll was over 80. Entire blocks were abandoned. The government blamed criminal elements, but everyone in Sinaloa knew this was no longer about territory. This was about vengeance. The streets were soaked in it. From that day on, there would be no turning back. The cartel that once ruled Mexico's drug empire as one voice had become 2 armies. Each promised they were protecting Sinaloa, avenging their fallen, defending their legacy. But in truth, both were fighting for the same throne, and both were willing to burn the kingdom to keep it. In every empire built on loyalty, betrayal doesn't arrive with warning shots, it comes with a whisper. It's the phone call that isn't returned, the convoy that doesn't show, the message marked seen but never answered. In Sinaloa, whispers travel faster than bullets, And one by one, they began to undo the family that once called itself invincible. For months, the sons of El Chapo had lived like royalty, armored trucks, private parties, narco corridos celebrating their name, but even royalty can bleed. When rumors spread that one of the Chapitos had given U.S. agents information about El Mayo's finances, the silence between the two factions hardened into a wall. The mountain men stopped answering their radios. The city men stopped paying their tribute. Two halves of a brotherhood now prepared to hunt each other. El Mayo, the old fox, had survived every war since the 1970s. His rule was built on patience, on letting others burn themselves while he stayed invisible. But invisibility has a cost. Your enemies think you're weak. And as the Chapitos' videos flooded social media, showing fleets of gold-plated rifles and pickup convoys with music blaring, the old man's patience snapped. He ordered silence. No more songs. No more cameras. No more disrespect. By late 2024, assassination squads moved like shadows through Culiacan. Drive-bys were replaced by surgical hits. Gunmen disguised as soldiers entered hotels and left no survivors. Every shooting carried a signature, a mark that said who was responsible. And the families of both sides began to vanish, wives, cousins, uncles, abducted quietly at dawn and never seen again. The war that started as a dispute over power had become personal. It wasn't about territory anymore, it was about humiliation, revenge, and family. The sons of El Chapo swore to destroy anyone who questioned their right to rule. The Mayos vowed to cleanse Sinaloa of arrogance. Every bullet fired was a message. Every corpse left in the street was punctuation. Meanwhile, the outside world began to close in. The U.S. Treasury issued new sanctions. The DEA leaked names of mid-level commanders who had once been ghosts. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies exposed, and suddenly, even the most loyal accountants started to panic. Money, the glue that held the empire together, began to crumble. Then came the unthinkable: Chapo Guzmán, captured and extradited to the United States. The government celebrated, but inside Sinaloa, the arrest detonated like a bomb. To some, it was proof that the Chapitos had fallen. To others, it was proof of betrayal, that someone inside the family had made a deal to save themselves. And when suspicion enters blood, no loyalty survives it. As Ovidio sat in a U.S. courtroom, the streets of Sinaloa drowned in reprisal. Entire villages emptied overnight. Families fled to the mountains, carrying what little they could. Local journalists went silent, radio stations played music to fill the air between gunfire. The cartel had become something it was never meant to be, not a business, not a brotherhood, but a war machine devouring its own children. And through it all, the legend of El Mayo, the man who never showed his face, turned from myth to ghost story. Some said he fled to the Sierra Madre. Others whispered he was dead. But the truth was worse: he was watching. Waiting. Pulling strings from the shadows, letting both sides exhaust themselves until only one would be left standing, the one he chose. By the end of that year, the body count had passed 2,000. The once mighty cartel that ruled continents now fought over villages. Its name, Sinaloa, once synonymous with power, now meant only blood. And as the sun set on 2025, those who had built the empire could no longer tell friend from foe, brother from enemy, or loyalty from survival. Because in the end, every cartel dies the same way, not by government bullets, not by law, but by its own reflection. By the dawn of 2025, the Sinaloa Cartel was no longer one empire, it was a shattered kingdom scattered across valleys, cities, and borders. The once organized hierarchy had splintered into fragments, each claiming to be the rightful heir to El Chapo's legacy. But no one was truly in control. Convoys once filled with discipline and pride now rolled through the streets like ghosts, half-empty trucks driven by boys who barely knew what they were fighting for. The guns were still loud, but the purpose had gone silent. The civilians, the people who had once lived under cartel protection, began to flee. For decades, Sinaloa's farmers had traded silence for safety. Now that pact was broken. Mothers whispered their prayers over photographs of missing sons. Schools closed without warning. The local markets that once thrived on cartel money stood empty, their shutters rattling in the wind. You could feel the absence of control, not just in the gunfire, but in the silence that followed it. And in that silence, something darker grew: distrust. Those who once benefited from the cartel's shadow economy began turning on each other. Local politicians who once smiled in photo ops now hid behind armored doors. Police officers quietly disappeared from their posts. The state's government tried to claim order had returned, but everyone knew that was a lie. Power, in Sinaloa, had never belonged to the government. It had always belonged to those who could make people disappear. Across the border, the DEA called it progress. Press conferences were held. Charts were shown. Millions in assets seized, dozens of arrests made. But what the cameras didn't show, what no agent dared to admit, was that every head cut from the Sinaloa Hydra only grew two more. Every arrest created a vacuum. And every vacuum was filled by someone younger, hungrier, and more brutal. The real war was not ending. It was evolving. Meanwhile, deep in the Sierra Madre Mountains, rumors whispered of El Mayo. Some said he was ill, dying, even. Others said he was watching from exile, letting the chaos cleanse his empire until only the loyal remained. A man who had survived 40 years in the trade didn't vanish without reason. His silence was his weapon. Because in the cartel world, silence is not surrender. It's strategy. For the younger generation, the sons and nephews of dead capos, power had lost its glamour. They grew up in a world where heroes became informants, where the narco dream was no longer gold chains and songs, but paranoia and sleepless nights. Their idols were ghosts, their future a gamble. The very thing that once defined Sinaloa, loyalty, had turned into its poison. But the story of the Sinaloa Cartel was never just about drugs. It was about a land shaped by poverty, by geography, by survival. Those mountains and deserts made men who were too hard to break, men who saw the law not as authority, but as another rival to outsmart. And when the government claimed victory, those same mountains laughed quietly. Because as long as there is hunger, there will be someone willing to risk everything to feed it. The legacy of Sinaloa lives on, not in palaces or mansions, but in memory. Every song sung in the cantinas, every whispered story at night, carries the name of the men who once ruled the underworld. To outsiders, they were criminals. To those who lived in their shadow, they were law, order, and chaos combined. That's the paradox of Sinaloa: you can destroy the cartel, but you can't erase the myth. Because the myth was built from pain. And so, the empire fell, not with an explosion, not with a gunfight, but with a sigh. The kind of sigh that comes when everyone finally realizes the truth: power built on fear doesn't last. It only changes hands. Today, the world still feels the echo of that fall, in the streets of Culiacan, in the corridors of Washington, and in the memories of those who lived to tell the tale. The Sinaloa Cartel may have fractured, but the world it created still lives in the shadows, waiting for another name, another leader, another war. The real story behind Sinaloa's civil war isn't just about drugs, or power, or revenge. It's about how far men will go to protect their legacy, and how easily legacy becomes legend, and legend becomes curse. Somewhere tonight, deep in the hills of Sinaloa, a new convoy moves under the stars, headlights off, engines silent, just as they did decades ago. The names may change, but the land remembers. When the shooting stops in Sinaloa, silence doesn't mean peace, it means exhaustion. The air still smells of gunpowder long after the last bullet casing hits the dirt. The city learns to live around its scars. Bullet holes become part of the walls, burnt cars become landmarks, and the stories of the dead become the lullabies of the living. You can feel it, an invisible weight pressing against every street corner, every hill, every whisper. Sinaloa doesn't bury its ghosts. It carries them. In the small towns that once fed the empire, women wait at kitchen tables that have grown cold. They stir coffee and stare at empty chairs, listening to the distant hum of trucks on the highway, hoping one might bring their sons home. Some never do. Others return in wooden boxes wrapped in plastic. Yet even in mourning, there's no silence. The narco corridos keep playing on the radio, voices of the fallen immortalized in song. To outsiders, it's entertainment. To them, it's memory. In the cantinas, the stories grow bigger with each drink. Gunfights become legends. Names turn into myths. Men who once hid from the police now live forever in verses sung by musicians paid in cash and fear. You can walk into any bar in the Sierra Madre and hear the past being rewritten, heroes made of villains, villains made of martyrs. That's the true magic of Sinaloa. It never forgets its dead, it remakes them. But not all ghosts sing. Some whisper. In the backstreets of Culiacan, murals of fallen capos fade under the sun, their faces cracked by time. Children walk past them without knowing the blood that built their world. To them, El Chapo is just a name on a t-shirt. The war is a story their fathers lived through, a story they now scroll past on their phones between TikToks and Reels. The cartel that once ruled the world is now just content. The narco culture didn't die, it evolved. Online, young influencers flaunt gold-plated pistols and designer clothes, calling themselves mini-narcos. They film convoy parades, luxury cars, and lavish parties, chasing the ghost of a power they'll never understand. Each like, each share, is another heartbeat of an empire that refuses to rest. The war has moved from the mountains to the algorithm. But behind the filters and the fame, the pain remains real. Entire villages still live without fathers, sons, or brothers. The poppy fields still bloom where blood once spilled. And in the quiet between songs, you can almost hear the truth, the sound of a land that's been crying for too long, covered by music so people can pretend it doesn't hurt anymore. Some journalists still try to tell the story, those brave enough to pick up the camera or pen knowing it might be their last act. They move through cities with fear stitched into their shadows, documenting what's left of truth. For every story published, another voice disappears. But they write anyway, because in Sinaloa, truth has always been a dangerous kind of courage. And the families, they don't build monuments, they build memories. Every wedding, every christening, every quiet prayer is a rebellion against the chaos. Life continues not because they forget, but because they refuse to. The people of Sinaloa have learned to dance with death and keep living. That's their survival, a rhythm that even bullets couldn't stop. But every celebration carries an absence. Somewhere in the crowd, there's always someone missing, a seat left empty, a name not spoken. The ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt hearts. And when the fireworks fade and the music stops, the people remember that peace here is borrowed, never owned. Because in Sinaloa, the line between life and legend is thinner than smoke. The ghosts of Sinaloa don't rest in cemeteries. They ride with the wind across the valleys, they whisper through the streets of Culiacan, they sit at the edge of every story that begins with "Once upon a time, there was a man named El Chapo." And even when the empire has fallen, its shadow remains, long, quiet, and unbroken. Because you can kill a man, but not his legend. You can silence a gun, but not the echo. Out of the silence left behind by the Sinaloa Cartel's collapse, something new began to stir. It didn't start with gunfire or headlines, it started online. In chat rooms, encrypted groups, and private channels, the new generation of traffickers began to rebuild what the old one destroyed. They were smarter, quieter, more connected, not sons of the mountains, but sons of the internet. The cartel no longer wore boots, it wore servers. They called themselves by new names, groups no one had ever heard of, cells that changed titles every month, flags that existed only as emojis. Their empire wasn't built on loyalty but on code. Cryptocurrency replaced cash. Drones replaced scouts. The cocaine routes of the old world merged with cyber networks of the new. The war had gone digital and invisible. In this new world, the rules were different. The old bosses relied on silence, the new ones relied on virality. Violence became performance. Assassinations were filmed, edited, and posted within minutes, a new form of control through fear and spectacle. The cartels no longer needed newspapers to spread their message. They had algorithms. But the government had evolved too. Surveillance drones hovered above jungles, satellites tracked heat signatures through clouds, and artificial intelligence flagged shipments before they reached borders. It was a new kind of war, one fought not with armies, but with data. Somewhere in a gray office in Washington or Mexico City, analysts tracked the ghosts of men who no longer existed on paper but still controlled millions in product and lives. Still, even the smartest systems can't stop hunger. In the dusty villages of Sinaloa, where opportunities die faster than dreams, the cycle continues. Every boy with no future still sees a gun as a way out. Every young man still wants his name in a song. Poverty doesn't end, it just changes faces. The land remembers, and the land always finds a new son to carry the torch. Meanwhile, the world keeps consuming. The same markets that once made Sinaloa rich, Los Angeles, Chicago, London, still crave what the mountains provide. Demand doesn't vanish, it only grows. And somewhere along that invisible line between supply and need, a new kind of trafficker thrives, cleaner, global, corporate. The cartel no longer needs to hide in jungles, it hides in boardrooms. But while the world modernized, the code of blood never changed. In 2026, reports surfaced of a new alliance, remnants of the Chapitos, fragments of El Mayo's men, and younger lieutenants seeking order out of chaos. They called it La Nueva Federación, the new federation. To some, it was hope. To others, a warning. History was beginning again, under new management. The journalists who survived the old wars began to see the pattern. Every generation swears it will end differently. Every empire promises peace. But peace never lasts where profit thrives. Because Sinaloa isn't just a place, it's a system, a mindset, a hunger that outlives every leader. The faces change, the weapons change, the names change, but the story remains the same. And now, somewhere in those mountains, a convoy rolls again. Black SUVs glide through the night without headlights, moving like ghosts over familiar dirt roads. Inside one of them sits a young man, silent, staring out the window. His father was killed in the war, his uncle vanished, his mother told him never to go back. But he's here anyway. Because Sinaloa doesn't ask permission. It calls you home. And so, the cycle turns again. The empire that fell is reborn, smaller, sharper, smarter. The ghosts of the old world whisper to the new kings, and the bloodlines that once burned the land now seed its rebirth. The war doesn't end. It evolves. Because in Sinaloa, power isn't inherited, it's resurrected. And every dawn brings another shadow ready to claim it. When the last gun falls silent, when the smoke fades, and the news stops reporting, the story doesn't end. It lingers, in the hearts of those who lost everything, and in the minds of those who still chase what power promises. The Sinaloa Cartel may have changed its name, its leaders, its weapons, but its shadow still stretches across oceans and borders. You can trace it in the silence of a small town, in the rhythm of a narco corrido, or in the whisper of someone saying, "It's not over." Because stories like this never really end. They just fade until someone dares to tell them again. The war for control, for loyalty, for survival, it continues in different names and faces, but it's always the same story: power, betrayal, blood. The real truth behind Sinaloa's civil war isn't written in history books or government files, it's written in the land itself. And the land never forgets. Somewhere tonight, in the same mountains where it all began, the wind carries a familiar echo, engines in the dark, laughter behind tinted glass, a convoy moving toward another dawn. Different men, same story. Because in the end, Sinaloa doesn't die. It waits. And as long as there's power to claim, as long as there's someone willing to pay the price for it, the war continues, unseen but never gone. This was the real story behind Sinaloa's cartel civil war, the rise, the fall, the ghosts, and the rebirth of an empire built on silence. And remember, silence isn't peace. If you've watched this far, you've seen what most never will: the truth behind the myths, the stories buried beneath the headlines. This is True Crime Cartel series, where every shadow has a history, and every legend has a body behind it. Like, share, comment your thoughts below. And subscribe, not just for another story, but for another truth that's waiting in the dark.